I'm Olivia Otieno. This is Double O Direct. Good afternoon. We are three. SpiceFM is 3 years old. And the question to you is, given the resources, what small business would you start? Or have you actually just recently started? Let us know on the socials, SpiceFM KE. But with me now is the lady I played some Sinead O'Connor for, because they are kindred. They are kin. They're all from Ireland. Her name is Anne Marlborough, legal and human rights activist and part of the European Union Electoral Observation Mission. Anne, welcome to Double O Direct.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm delighted to join you today. Great to be here.
Excellent. You know, it's going to be really hard to ask you those tough questions because you have such a friendly demeanor about you. And the accent helps a lot.
Good. And the music helped. It was wonderful to start. You put me at great ease with an Irish woman singing. So yes, but really I don't see there being any contestation in what we talk about. We're going to talk, I think, about human rights, and it's all positive. So
excellent.
Look forward to it.
An overview of EOM, the Electoral Observation Mission, in a nutshell.
Yes, indeed. So election observation, very unusual entity. We are invited by the authorities of a state to come and observe their election, to look at it through a human rights perspective, to look at an election through the lens of the international legal commitments that a state has undertaken, the regional legal commitments. And we come as very much as neutral observers. We come following a UN declaration of principles about election observation that guides how we work. So we have a very specific methodology. We do the same thing wherever we go. So it's universal what we do. It's not really specific to the country or the region. We follow the universal and regional standards. So what we do is we arrive, we're invited into a country by the authorities, and then we spend our time really talking, trying to meet every possible stakeholder in an election. And that's from the highest level of government to the level of the voter. We really try to gauge what everybody thinks about their election, but also what they're doing in the election. So we try to understand the legal framework. What's prescribed about an election in a country, and then how is that enforced and executed in reality? Because there might be magnificent laws in a country and the election might not be so magnificent. So it's all about assessing each election as a unique event and as a process that goes through voter registration, candidate registration, the election campaign itself, then finally the actual voting, the polling, the counting, the tabulation. And then we also look very closely at electoral dispute resolution. So it's a long process. So for example, for us in Kenya, we arrived here, I think it was the 24th of June, I left home. And I'll be here sort of, I'm not sure until when actually. Yes. I have an open-ended contract. And the idea is that we try to follow the process through to the very end. So in the event that there are electoral disputes, petitions in courts, we do stay and follow those through. And then after we're finished, after the whole process is finished, we offer a final report to the authorities and to the people of Kenya. This will be a public document, and in it we'll have our assessment, all of those various elements of the election, how they went, how they complied with the law, what are the areas where maybe there are infelicities, things that maybe didn't go so well, things where maybe the law isn't perfect. And then we'll offer a set of recommendations around practical reform, law reform, the things that we think might be considered by the various stakeholders within their own area of responsibility to see how future electoral cycles might be improved. So that's what we do.
So just taking a step back.
Yes.
I recently heard from a business coach that you need to solve a problem. With regards to the development and the establishing of EOM, the Electoral Observation Mission, what was the problem that was being solved by this organization?
It's not actually a problem at all. We really come as a positive sort of a capacity building measure almost for elections. So the EOM, we're here as it's the European Union EOM. Kenya invited many election observation missions. There are national domestic citizen observer groups and there are international ones. So we were one of many. The African Union was here, COMESA, the Commonwealth, IGAD, many of the regional bodies were here as observers. And so we were invited as the European Union, because the European Union engages a lot in election observation. The reason why it does so is it's an important part of the European Union's foreign policy and human rights, because it's really seen as something we try to do in the spirit of partnership to assist partner states to improve their electoral processes. So we really see it as not about fixing a problem, but as offering support and guidance and partnership for future improvement.
Were you initially, when was it founded? When did it actually start? When did you start?
Well,
EOM?
This particular EOM, it started it started a while ago, because first of all, there were discussions with the government here as to whether they were inviting an election observation mission. Now, we did expect an invitation.
Oh, no, I think you misunderstand the question.
Oh, yes.
When was EOM formed?
Well, there's no one EOM. So we have a different election observation mission, an EOM, for every single election in every single country that we're invited to. So the European Union, the EU, we've had more than 160 EOMs to date.
Do you observe European countries as well?
The European Union doesn't observe within the EU, but there's another international organisation that does so. It's called the OSCE, Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And so they observe elections in all their member states, which are quite many. It's North America, Europe, and all of Europe. It includes Russia. So it stretches from Russia to the US and Canada and all of our member states across Europe.
Fantastic. So if we can get into understanding your background and the basis for your being a part of this particular mission, give me a brief, for example.
About myself?
And Marlborough.
Well, I'm not that young anymore, Olivia, so it might be a little bit lengthy, but my background is in law and human rights. So I studied law, I have 4 degrees, and I used to teach. I had a tenured position as an academic, but I was always involved in activism around human rights and around women's rights. I come from Ireland, so we have a legal system that has been very conservative and traditional. Our constitution dates back to 1937. The Catholic Church has had a very strong influence on our laws. So it's something that always interested me and I was involved in. And so gradually the activism became more, and I moved out of academia into the world of civil society. And I worked for a humanitarian NGO for a few years, Concern, an Irish NGO. And indeed it brought me to Kenya back in 2007. I was here for the World Social Forum. But gradually I just discovered election observation through the Irish government, the Department of Foreign Affairs. And the department secunds people to join these EOMs. And so my first one was back in 2007 in Nigeria. And so for the last 10 years now, this is what I do exclusively. We're all self-employed consultants. So we go home in between. I do a lot of research on constitutional law and electoral law. And then I go to the countries that I would like to go to and observe their elections. So it's a
With
great
regards
privilege.
to Nigeria, you mentioned that was your first mission as an observer. What stood out for you in 2007?
It was fascinating because I didn't know what election observation was. Most people don't. Why would they? It's a very niche sphere. So I was in a different capacity then. I was a long-term observer. And here on this mission, we have 48 long-term observers. They indeed are back in Nairobi today now, winding down and debriefing with us. But the long-term observer is sent off to here it would be a county. There in Nigeria, it was a state. And the long-term observers, a pair of them, they stay put there for the entire duration, maybe 2 months. So it's all about getting acquainted with an area, with its political issues, with the economic context, the social context, and really just having a deep understanding and analysis of that area and building rapport at the very local level with the electoral management body staff, with the with all of the institutions of justice, with the courts, the magistrates, the police. And it's fascinating. It's a real privilege to get to spend a couple of months just getting to know an area and getting to know all of the issues around the election. And so those long-term observers then report weekly back to the core team in the state capital. So this time now I and this is what I do, is I just do the work at the central level, the legal and human rights analysis for the mission. So both jobs are fascinating, but they're different. So I also like this opportunity to bring my own legal background to bear on the context as I find it here in Kenya.
Excellent. I'm going to go into challenges and any, shall I say, irregularities that you may have observed, not here, but you may have observed as a long-term observer while you were still in Nigeria in 2007, in just a bit. About Nigeria, 2007, the report that you submitted as part of a long-term observer. Anything that happened or didn't happen that may have perhaps surprised you?
Well, the follow-up really rests with the European Union delegation in the country. I, as an individual, wouldn't be following up. It's part of the long-term ongoing cooperation between the European Union and whatever state invites us to have an election observation mission. So, for example, here in Kenya, we're conducting the election observation mission. But we're an independent body. We're separate from the EU while we're here. But we will offer this final report when we leave, which includes a set of recommendations for law reform, etc. So what we would hope is that then over the rest of the next electoral cycle, over the 5 years ahead, that the EU delegation will use that report and consider it in their programming, in their partnership with the country. So it might be to do with for example, collaboration with UNDP, the basket fund for the next election. It might be to do with support for women and political participation of women or political participation of other groups. So the report does have a life after the EOM leaves the country, but it's not us personally that will be involved. But the EU has developed a new instrument about 5 years ago now. They came up with this idea that it's not enough to have these EOMs just when the election is on, when it takes place, and then you go away and 5 years later there's another election and we come back and we repeat the process. So there's an election follow-up mission now which has become standard sort of midway in the electoral cycle. So just as an example, back in March I spent the month in Maputo in Mozambique, looking at the progress there or lack of progress, or what was happening around the recommendations that the EU had offered on their previous election observation mission there. And that's a matter of course. So that's what we do. There are many ways that we try to sort of make an instrument of this final report. We don't want it to vanish into thin air after all the work. No, not at all.
What about the legal process and the legal aspects of this specific electoral process? Mm-hmm. What are your observations? What are your findings?
Well, I suppose the overall finding about the legal framework was quite positive. I mean, I even have it here. It's become like my sort of temporary
I read that. I downloaded it
Bible.
on my
Yes.
iPad
Yeah.
and I read through it.
Yes, I mean, your new constitution, I'm such a fan. It's magnificent. 2010, as it says, a transformative document. And there are magnificent provisions in there about fundamental rights and about the rights that we look at in our EOM. We look at the rights around political participation, the right to vote, the right to stand for election. And they are pretty good in here in this document, as are provisions around freedom of association, assembly, expression. And then looking at the practical realisation of those rights during this election, well, we found that really people did have freedom to campaign. There weren't restrictions on campaigning, that indeed candidates were even able to campaign pretty freely in opponent strongholds. And there was a fairly open environment for the campaign. So that was something that we assessed positively in this report, was the ground for political freedom. Political parties certainly are free to come into existence. People can set up political parties. You do have more than 80 registered political parties, and people may also stand for election quite readily. The political parties Act was amended, and the political party primaries seem to have gone quite peacefully in a much less tense fashion than has done so before. And also you have a judiciary that has been very open to quickly, expeditiously dealing with any matters that went wrong in the election or issues that people were dissatisfied with. I found things like there was this political parties disputes tribunal where people could go with grievances that they had against their political party, and those matters were dealt with very, very speedily indeed, and also very openly. I mean, some of that was COVID, but it really managed to galvanise your judiciary and get everything up online. So hearings were online, filings were online. That I found really, really, really impressive. Very, very impressive.
How would you rate us from the other African countries that you visited?
Well, I wouldn't dream.
No, us on paper.
No, on paper. I wouldn't dream of doing so anyway, because really, I'm looking at Kenya only in the light of your commitments, Kenya's international obligations, Kenya's regional obligations, and Kenya's domestic legal framework. And I must say the access to information about the law, to justice, to the knowledge about the law is so open.
Security?
Security. Well, there is certainly well catalogued a pretty grim history of violence in Kenya, particularly electoral violence, sexual and gender-based violence in the electoral context also, and certainly a huge history of police brutality and violations of human rights by police forces. But that's not something that we have catalogued in our observation during this electoral process. We specifically say in our preliminary findings that we did not record instances of excessive use of force by the police in the campaign context. I mean, just to bear in mind, our report is a very particular work. Our mandate is around the election and around the campaign. So looking at the law, it's great. In relation to these particular political freedoms, and the implementation is pretty great too. Now, there are many deficiencies, and those we've drawn attention to and will continue to do so.
Such as?
Such as even in the Constitution itself, there are some provisions that raise some questions, such as persons who have been declared to be of unsound mind. They're deprived of the right to vote, the right to stand for election. Yet on the other hand, Kenya has become a state party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, those two don't marry very well. Also, you have some magnificent provisions on affirmative action and equality in the Constitution, but they have not always seen reality.
Realised,
Unfortunately, they look so great, but there's been a parliamentary deficiency in some ways, in that the provisions in the Constitution are wonderful, but they're not self-executing, and they can't just be enforced unless there's legislation. And that middle step has been missing in the process, particularly, for example, around the 2/3 gender principle, but also around the principle of persons with disabilities having a 5% share in elected office. The area of minority and marginalised groups, that doesn't have its own piece of legislation either. And there's just...
Have there been attempts, so in your research and in your observations, as you came across these deficiencies, did you also come across attempts to mitigate them, or are those non-existent?
Yes, you also have a parliament in which there's been some tradition of introducing private members' bills. So there's been various pieces of draft legislation. There's been bills that have come in, but not bills that have been passed, or certainly bills that have been supported, promoted and advanced by government. That's been quite a glaring deficiency in some areas. So the problem seems to be that civil society is active and is advocating change in many areas. Courts indeed have on occasion instructed government to bring in legislation, but yet the legislation isn't in place. So, for example, for the marginalised groups, what they have is beautiful provisions in the Constitution, but then just piecemeal amendments to various pieces of election law, political parties law, various pieces of law, but no coherent means to advance the rights that are set out in the Constitution.
We had an individual who is a person with a disability, is marginalized, and his attempt to vie for a particular political office was thwarted.
Yes.
What was your observation of that?
Well, we certainly observed the case, the Reuben Kagame case, and we saw that the court did what it could to deal with the matter expeditiously, and it's certainly on the slate to be reviewed again in the months ahead. The problem there was really that the case probably came much too late. It came right close to the election, and we had the IEBC saying, we're already printing presidential ballot papers. We can't add somebody else to the ballot. But the High Court was saying there ought to be special provisions made for persons with disabilities. And for me, what this illustrates is the absence of legislation. The Constitution does say advance persons with disabilities in elected office, but there's no means to do so. And the IEBC was left without legislation giving them any instructions to do so. And the Constitution isn't self-executing. So that needs to be addressed.
You know, the fact that we have great legislation with regards to what's on paper, our Constitution is amazing, but there are gaps.
Thanks, Olivia. Yes, there is certainly gaps. And one of the most glaring gaps is around the area of campaign finance.
Yes.
Because there you do have laws. You have a campaign finance law, but it exists only on paper. There's absolutely no regulation of the amount of money that the candidates can generate and that they can spend and how they can spend it.
What does the law say? What does it say on paper?
So on paper, you have your constitution that sets out responsibilities for the IEBC, and that includes governing the spending during the campaign. And then you also have a Campaign Financing Act, and that says that the IEBC must regulate it. But it requires then subsidiary legislation, so
how
regulations.
Much? Yeah. Because what is the amount? Like, what is supposed to be, sanctioned vis-a-vis, and then if it's surpasses that, what are the consequences? So those are the gaps? Those
are the gaps. So the IEBC has developed regulations, and they've gone to the floor of the Parliament a couple of times, but for various reasons they really have been thwarted and have never come into force. So the IEBC did attempt to get them through this time, but for various reasons, unfortunately, Parliament found themselves unable to bring them into being.
Did you observe how much was being spent?
All we could say was vast amounts of money. It wouldn't be possible for, I think, any election observation mission to generate that kind of information. That's something your own media. Well, we certainly observed that there was a lot of money being spent on the campaign itself. And then on the huge rallies, we certainly saw and received many reports of money being openly dispersed to supporters. We ourselves didn't observe it, but we received reports from lots of other interlocutors. As part of our observation methodology, we really do cooperate and collaborate with all other observation missions. That's what we do, because of course the real experts on the elections in Kenya are the Kenyan observers, and as well the Kenyan media, the Kenyan people. So we've listened to them, and clearly this is one of the probably the gravest flaws in the whole electoral framework here, is the absence of regulation of campaign spending. You have a tiny bit of regulation of the finance of political parties, and that's with the ORPP, the Register of Political Parties. Her office has some oversight in that area, but unfortunately for the campaign, it's just unregulated. And then that means it's sort of a race to the top, that the candidates will try to outdo each other in spending. And the consequences of that are, well, obviously an unlevel playing field, but then even more obviously, it will disadvantage and disqualify almost certain people from participating. It means it becomes the domain of the elite, the rich elite. And generally, because of the socioeconomic realities of Kenya, no more than most of the world, women do not tend to be among the socioeconomic elite. Women are disadvantaged in the area of access to finance. So they're not going to be able to compete equally with men. It has been a negative for them.
I am Olivia Otieno. This is Double O Direct, a safe space for women every Saturday on SpiceFM from 10 a.m. You can reach out to me directly. You can via Instagram. My handle is just my name, Olivia Otieno, spelled OLIVIAOTIENO. Speaking of names, I've got Anne Marlborough, legal and human rights activist, and she's part of the European Union Electoral Observation Mission. And you're just telling me about how dismal we performed with regards to electing women this time round.
I'm afraid so, Olivia. Yes, I think I did use the word dismal. The figures, they've improved slightly from 2017, but that's still not a great deal to celebrate. For example, 3 women were elected as senators in 2017, and now again you have just 3 women as senators.
Yes.
And that's out of 47. And that is, just to look down, it's 6.4% of the elected senators are women.
So if we're talking about 2/3, how many were we supposed to have?
I'm not a mathematician. Let's see, 1/3.
Not many people are, apparently.
15. You should have about
average.
16. About 16.
Okay.
16
So we're
rather
doing
than
really
3. Yes.
Rather than 3. Okay.
16. Yeah, and for the for your National Assembly, that has improved a little bit. You have 30 women elected as opposed to 23 last time, but that is 30 out of 290, representing again just 7.9%.
In your observations leading up to the elections, in order to hope for 2/3,
Yes.
there must be at least 2/3 vying, aspirants. How were we doing with regards to the aspirants? Because if there were, let's say, 5 women vying for seats in the Senate and we got 3, that's not so bad.
No, your numbers vying were better than these figures would suggest, the percentage of women vying. But really the problem seems to lie with the political parties.
Okay.
They're not nominating women in sufficient numbers. Neither are they nominating them in the constituencies in which they're likely to win. Because often, obviously, parties can predict which constituencies they're likely to win in and which they're less likely to win. So they ought to be putting women in at least 1/3 of the seats that they're likely to win. That's what the 2/3 gender principle requires of them,
Yes.
that they try to meet it themselves. And the Supreme Court has said that the political parties ought to do so. They oughtn't to wait for legislation to do it. And the IEBC, to be fair, did try to impose this in this particular electoral cycle. They really did warn the political parties, counsel them, but it went to the High Court, and
Once again, their efforts were thwarted.
their efforts were thwarted. Their efforts were thwarted. But really, one looks forward to legislation to bring this about. But as well, political will, that's an issue in so many things, be it campaign finance regulation, be it the 2/3 gender rule. It's all about political will. To have the laws, fine, but to implement the laws. Laws are magnificent. There's plenty of paper. Paper doesn't refuse ink. But to do something about it, there must be political will. You have a magnificently vibrant civil society that is really trying to encourage the political leaders as much as possible. I've been so impressed at the level of strategic litigation within civil society here. You have NGOs who are very credibly taking cases before the courts to try to test the extent of the new constitution and to try to deliver on the human rights promises of it. But unless the political leaders then follow on, listen to what their civil society is saying, listen to what the courts are saying, there's still a gap there, unfortunately.
So we've identified that financing was a key challenge for getting women elected. We've also identified that parties aren't nominating as many women or even in the right locations as they should. So let's continue down your list.
Well, down our list, we have many other observations about the election that aren't specific then to women. They're really things to enhance the electoral process more broadly. One of the big issues is the IEBC itself and its preparedness for the election. One of the issues that we thought was problematic was around voter education. There was very poor funding long in advance for voter education, for civic education, and that does seem to be a gap.
What are the consequences of that? Because you mentioned that one of the reasons why election funding is out of control is because there's money being handed out during rallies, for example. You know, it's unregulated. So some of the consequences of that is a lack of civic education. a lack of voter education in general, and what can be done to mitigate that? Because if you're saying that the IABC wasn't as prepared in doing that, maybe that's some of the repercussions we're seeing now.
Well, I wouldn't, we'll say, blame the IBC for the handing out of the money. That's really down to the candidates and the political parties, because there is an election offences law, and bribery is illegal, disbursement of money is illegal. There's a lot of things that shouldn't be done. We as a mission, we saw the distribution of money ourselves on 21 occasions. So the law is being broken by candidates and political parties. So that's one thing to note. There is legal regulation. Enforcement is pretty difficult, because very difficult to have complaints, because you need witnesses, etc.
Yes.
But that's just one point. It's more, why is the culture there of this expectation that money is needed? Why is it not just about ideology, manifestos,
Leadership.
Leadership? These are issues that certainly surfaced in this election. Now, in our observation, though, we did find that this campaign period represented an improvement over the campaign narratives back in 2017. This time it was less, to some extent, less about ethnic tensions and ethnic political affiliation, and that there actually was some measure of address around the socioeconomic environment and socioeconomic issues, not just about the ethnic orientation, the ethnic affiliation of the voters.
And how did that impact women? Because as you've said, ethnicity is across board, but socioeconomic challenges hugely, unproportionately affect women. So what did you observe with that? Were they more willing to give up or to partake in certain activities simply because they were being given a handout?
That's a tough question. I suppose we don't have, nobody has that level of observation around the participation of women and their willingness to accept money or otherwise. I mean, what one can say is that historically, culturally, women have not been the breadwinners. Women have not had the same access to resources as men. Things like inheritance law here. But things are changing. Under the Constitution, you've had several new areas of law which have sought to promote equality. However, the most recent CEDAW, the Women's Convention, their most recent review of Kenya did still draw attention to areas like land ownership, like inheritance, like family law, that there's still some reform in those areas needed to empower women.
What about security? And I understand that. It makes a lot of sense. But other than the money to fund your campaign aspirations, security for women on the campaign trail, because you have to go around your ward, or you have to go around your constituency or around your county, and basic things like walking around after 6 p.m. or moving around, commuting from one place to another. What was your observation of that and the general security of women during this period?
Well, what we did in that context is listen so much to civil society here, particularly the voice of FIDA, and they documented many instances of violence against women during the campaign period. They documented in real time and real space physical violence against women, but they also documented violence against women in the virtual space and also in the narrative at some campaign rallies and the like. And for our mission, we observed, particularly in the social media, that there was a particular objectification of women, construction of women in a certain way, that women are not seen as traditionally as being appropriate political leaders, or that the political domain isn't the right domain for women, a construction of women as mothers, or a construction of women as not being good women if they're in that political space vying with men as equals. So those then one looks back. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights documented extensive sexual and gender-based violence in previous elections. And it's not just back to 2007. Also, they documented many violations of the rights of women in the 2017 election. I mean, we await further publication of what they've observed in this particular campaign cycle, but we've been talking to them. And I mean, thankfully, the level of violence of previous elections against women has not been observed. But to be even talking about this is a worrying aspect of the election here in Kenya, that it is something that women have to think about. It's not a given that elections are safe for women.
SpiceFM. This is 00 Direct from 10 a.m. every Saturday. And as an entrepreneur, as a woman in business, especially as you start out, you need to maximize every opportunity afforded to you. You need to take advantage of anything that will help you survive and eventually thrive. One such opportunity is coming your way right after I wrap things up with Marlborough, part of the EU Electoral Observation Mission, who was telling me that with the exit of the UK, the Republic of Ireland is the only English-speaking country left in the European Union. You must be in high demand, Anne.
Olivia, yes, I was lucky me, having been colonised by the British. They've given me the present of their language, and they've given me the present of the common law legal system. So I do work in many other countries that were colonised like we were, because the legal systems are so similar, and I have a degree in the English language as well. So yes, I do. But it suits me. I love working in Africa and the continent.
In former colonies.
Yes, I do.
But
yes.
Down to the numbers.
Yes.
Right? The most important thing about the election, of course, is the outcome. Mm-hmm. And primarily the outcome boils down to the numbers. What have you as EOM observed with regards to the ballot process, the collection of the ballot papers, mm-hmm. The dissemination of that information, mm-hmm. and with regards to the announcement of the candidates with regards to those who mm-hmm. have secured seats?
Yes, well, I suppose for us, it is actually not necessarily the end of the process that is our sole concern. We're really looking at all the stages along the way. So it was the work of the IEBC from voter registration through candidate registration and on, and we're still watching. And I suppose at this stage, we're so aware that there is so likely to be litigation. The deadline for filing a presidential election petition is 2:00 on Monday, and certainly it has been indicated that a petition is imminent. And you do have the sub judice rule in your law here that once something is before the courts, it's not feasible to talk about it. So
it is not yet before the courts.
Oh, Olivia, you are pressing me, but I think it's very sensitive.
Yeah.
From our perspective, the important thing is that the process of handling the results and accepting them is dealt with peacefully and is dealt with appropriately.
May I ask, has
Yes.
there been a request from the mission, the EOM, to provide, preliminary reports, maybe in the facilitation of the petitioning?
No, we have only made one public statement so far, and that was 2 days after the election. On that occasion, our head of mission, our chief observer, a member of the European Parliament, a Slovakian politician, Ivan Stefanec, he delivered our preliminary findings, and that was up to that particular stage. Tabulation was still ongoing at the county tabulation centres, and we were having very good access to the tallying at that stage, and we were finding it to be very transparent. Now, our mission has remained and has watched the tallying through the county level to the national level. And we maintained a presence throughout in the BOMAS, but we haven't made any public comment since then. Our chief of foreign policy back in Brussels, Joseph Borrell, he has made a comment, and his comment was very much, please, everybody, just use the electoral dispute resolution systems that are available. And that's all that I would really echo, is let it be taken to court if there is a dispute, and then let it be dealt with judicially and appropriately. But we wouldn't be issuing any further documentation now. So instead what we do is we stay. We sort of accompany the process, we observe it. But our interventions are always, when it's over, our interventions are looking forward to the next time. So it's probably quite disappointing, but I won't be really drawn now on the current situation. It's too sensitive.
With that, I would like to thank you, Anne Marlborough, for joining me today on 00 Direct. And yeah, it is what it is.
Well, thank you very much, Olivia. I've been delighted with the opportunity to talk to you about the work of the Election Observation Mission. We're all very grateful to you for the opportunity. And I've enjoyed myself immensely. So thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your time in Kenya.
Thank you very much.
SpiceFM.